What if the ragged old man you laughed at, the one you dismissed as worthless, was a hero who once carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire? Imagine sneering at his worn clothes, mocking his quiet question about a truck's price, only to learn he's a veteran whose sacrifices paved the way for your freedom. At a bustling used car dealership, a group of smug salesmen thought they could humiliate Henry Brooks, a homeless man with weathered hands and a tattered jacket, for daring to dream of a pickup truck. They taunted him, their laughter echoing across the lot, oblivious to the storm they were stirring. Henry walked away, his soldier's pride unbroken, but the next morning, the roar of military engines would shatter their arrogance. This is the story of how one man's quiet dignity summoned a reckoning that would echo far beyond the dealership's gaudy banners. The morning sun glinted off the polished hoods of the used car dealership's lot, each vehicle a silent promise of freedom and possibility. Henry Brooks stood at the edge of the pavement, his worn boots rooted to the ground, his eyes fixed on an old Ford pickup truck that seemed to call to him across the years. It was the same model he dreamed of owning as a young man, before the deserts of Afghanistan, before the weight of war and loss had carved deep lines into his face. His tattered jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands, weathered by time and hardship, trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the truck's side mirror. The cool metal felt like a tether to a life he'd almost forgotten, a life where he'd had a home, a purpose, a future. Henry was 69 now, a veteran who'd served with courage in a war that left scars no one could see. Discharged and adrift, he'd found civilian life a foreign land, its rules and rhythms alien to a man who'd once navigated battlefields. Homeless for years, he slept in parks or under bridges, his military boots polished to a stubborn shine, his cracked plastic wallet holding a faded service ID, the last relics of a time when he'd belonged. Nightmares haunted him, memories of gunfire and fallen comrades. But he carried them quietly, his dignity a shield against a world that rarely looked twice. Some days, strangers offered a dollar or a kind word, their eyes sliding away from his. Most days they didn't. He'd come to the dealership on a whim, drawn by the truck's familiar shape, a spark of hope flickering in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could ask its price, hold on to a dream even if it was out of reach. He stepped forward, his stride slow but steady, each movement carrying the discipline of decades. The glass doors of the office swung open, and a young salesman emerged, his pressed shirt and slick smile a stark contrast to Henry's weathered appearance. The salesman's eyes swept over him, boots, jacket, unshaven jaw, and his smile curdled into a smirk. "Hey, old man, this isn't a charity stop," he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "You can't afford anything here." Henry's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a quiet strength. "I just wanted to know the price," he said, his eyes still on the truck. The salesman laughed, a sharp, cutting sound, and waved over two colleagues lounging by the coffee machine. "Hear that, guys? He wants to know the price." They sauntered over, cups in hand, their grins wide and mocking. "What's he going to pay with? His bottle caps," one said, nudging the other. "Or maybe that fancy jacket. Bet it's worth a tire," the second added, sparking another round of laughter. Customers nearby glanced over, then quickly looked away, their faces blank or uncomfortable. A young mother pulled her son closer, whispering something that made him stare at Henry with wide, curious eyes before hurrying off. Henry stood still, his face impassive, the same mask he'd worn under enemy fire. The laughter stung, each word landing like a stone, but he didn't flinch. His fingers brushed the service ID in his pocket, a talisman against the world's cruelty. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He turned, his back straight as a soldier's, and walked away, the salesman's jeers following him like a bitter wind. Behind him, the dealership's balloons bobbed cheerfully, their bright colors a mockery of the respect he'd been denied. Across the street, a woman paused mid-swipe as she washed her car, her hose dripping onto the pavement. She watched Henry's retreat, her brow furrowing, a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossing her face. She opened her mouth as if to call out, then closed it, her shoulders sagging as she returned to her task. Henry kept walking, his steps measured, his head high. He didn't see her hesitation, didn't hear the salesman's laughter fade into smug satisfaction. He carried the weight of their words heavy as the rucksack he'd once marched with through deserts, but his spine never bent. Some burdens, he knew, were carried not because they were light, but because they were his. At a coffee shop down the block, two older men sat by the window, their cups steaming. "That guy," one said, nodding toward Henry's fading figure. "Looks like he's been through it. Military, maybe?" The other shrugged, stirring his coffee. "Hard to say. Lots of folks claim to be vets these days." Their voices trailed off, the conversation drifting to weather and politics, safer ground that didn't ask them to care. Henry disappeared around the corner, a solitary figure against the city's hum, his story unknown to those who'd seen him pass. But stories, like soldiers, have a way of finding their way home, and Henry's was just beginning to unfold. The dealership's lot shimmered under the midday sun, its rows of cars gleaming like trophies of a world Henry Brooks no longer belonged to. Inside the office, the salesmen lounged, their laughter from the morning's encounter with Henry still fresh, now morphing into a game of one-upmanship. The lead salesman, a wiry man named Kyle with a grin too sharp for sincerity, leaned back in his chair, mimicking Henry's stooped posture. "Bet he's out there pricing hubcaps with his spare change," he said, sparking another round of chuckles from his colleagues. One of them, a stocky man named Greg, pulled out his phone, replaying the video he'd covertly recorded of Henry's humiliation. "This is gold," Greg said, his thumbs flying as he posted it to a social media group with the caption, "When bums think they can shop for cars." The post gained traction, jumping from one platform to another, each share amplifying the cruelty of the moment. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to Henry's quiet exit. The woman washing her car across the street finished her task, the memory of Henry's straight-backed retreat nagging at her. She told herself she couldn't have done anything, but the thought felt hollow, like an excuse that wouldn't stick. At the coffee shop on the corner, the two elderly men lingered over their cups, their brief speculation about Henry's past fading into talk of gas prices and local news. "Probably just another drifter," one said, dismissing the flicker of recognition he'd felt in Henry's disciplined stride. The other nodded, stirring cream into his coffee, the act a small shield against the unease of their apathy. Henry, meanwhile, found refuge in a small park a few blocks away. He sat on a weathered bench, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes tracing the cracks in the pavement. The park was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic, a rare pocket of stillness in a city that never paused. From his pocket, he pulled a faded photograph, himself and his son, Michael, standing side by side in uniform, their faces bright with pride after Michael's officer training graduation. Henry's thumb brushed over the image, a faint smile softening the lines of his face. The photo was creased, its edges worn, but it held a truth the world had forgotten. He'd been a hero once, a man who dragged wounded comrades to safety under a hail of bullets, his own blood staining the Afghan dust. He tucked the photo away, his gaze lifting to the sky. The salesman's laughter echoed in his mind, not as pain, but as a reminder of how far he'd fallen. He didn't blame them, not really. They saw what the world saw, a tattered jacket, a tired face, a man with nothing to his name. But Henry knew who he was, even if they didn't. His boots, polished despite the cracks, his service ID, guarded like a relic. These were his anchors, proof of a life that had mattered. He sat with the stillness of a soldier awaiting orders, his back straight, his heart steady. The world could mock him, but it couldn't break him. Back at the dealership, the salesman's amusement grew bolder. Kyle stood, exaggerating Henry's slow walk for another laugh. "Guys like that should stick to the shelters," he said, scrolling through the comments on Greg's video. "Look at this. 50 likes already." The others grinned, tossing in their own jabs, each one a brick in the wall of their smug superiority. "Scares off real customers," Greg added, mimicking Henry's soft voice. "I just wanted to know the price." Their laughter filled the office, spilling out to the lot where a few browsers glanced over, then quickly looked away, unwilling to challenge the status quo. The video, however, had reached eyes they hadn't anticipated. In a private group chat for Marine Corps veterans, the clip landed like a grenade. Men and women who'd served, who knew the cost of war in their bones, watched in silence. They saw what the salesman missed: the squared shoulders, the measured steps, the bearing of a man who'd stood under fire. One veteran, a grizzled former sergeant named Tom, forwarded the video to a contact with a single line: "This him." The recipient was Lieutenant Michael Brooks, Henry's son, stationed at Fort Carson with an armored division. Michael was in the middle of a training drill when the message pinged his phone. He opened the video, his jaw tightening as he watched his father's quiet dignity mocked by men who'd never known sacrifice. He didn't respond to Tom. Instead, he sent a curt text to his unit: "Prep the convoy." Now within minutes, orders rippled through the base. No questions were asked, no explanations needed, just the unspoken bond of those who'd served together. Vehicles were fueled, gear checked, a Humvee adorned with the American flag positioned at the front. A senior officer, catching wind of the mobilization, approached Michael. "What's this about, Lieutenant?" he asked. Michael showed him the video. The officer's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Take my vehicle," he said, pointing to a reinforced transport. "Lead the line." Michael nodded, his eyes hard as stone. The salesman had no idea what was coming, but the wheels of justice were already turning, and Henry Brooks would not walk alone much longer. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the used car dealership, where the salesman's laughter had settled into a smug routine. Kyle, the ringleader, leaned against a shiny SUV, scrolling through the growing likes on Greg's viral video of Henry Brooks's humiliation. "This thing's blowing up," he said, grinning as he read a comment. "Bet he's still crying over that truck." Greg chuckled, tossing a stress ball between his hands. "Should we post a follow-up? Bum of the Day, Part 2? Their third colleague, a lanky man named Derek, smirked, but glanced nervously toward the lot, as if sensing a shift in the air. The other customers, sensing the casual cruelty, kept their distance, their eyes fixed on car stickers or the horizon, anywhere but the salesman's self-satisfied circle. Across town, Henry sat on his park bench, the faded photograph of himself and Michael tucked back into his pocket. His hands rested on his knees, his gaze distant, as if searching for something the world had long since taken. The salesman's words replayed in his mind, not as wounds but as echoes of a truth he'd learned long ago. Respect was a currency the world rarely spent on men like him. Yet he didn't bow under their mockery. His boots, scuffed but polished, his posture, unyielding despite the weight of years, spoke of a strength that no taunt could touch. He closed his eyes, letting the park's quiet wrap around him, a brief respite from a city that had forgotten his name. But Henry's name was not forgotten everywhere. At Fort Carson, Lieutenant Michael Brooks stood in the motor pool, his uniform crisp, his face a mask of controlled fury. The video had shaken him, not just for the insult to his father, but for what it revealed about a world that let heroes fall so far. His squad moved with precision around him, securing vehicles, checking radios, their silence a testament to the bond forged in shared sacrifice. Michael's text, "Prep the convoy, now," had sparked immediate action, no questions asked. These were men and women who knew the cost of war, who recognized the quiet courage in Henry's walk, even through a grainy phone video. As the convoy took shape, a grizzled master sergeant approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Brooks," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "What's the play?" Michael handed him the phone, the video playing on a loop. The sergeant watched, his jaw tightening as Kyle's smirk filled the screen. "That's your old man?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "He saved my platoon in '03, dragged 3 men to safety under fire. Lost half his blood doing it." The sergeant handed the phone back, his expression hard. "Get him the respect he's owed," he said. "I'm riding with you." Word spread through the base, quiet but electric. Soldiers who'd never met Henry Brooks joined the convoy, their loyalty not to a man but to what he represented. A young private, barely out of basic, polished the American flag on the lead Humvee, her hands steady with purpose. A captain offered his armored transport, insisting it take point. By late afternoon, the convoy was ready, a disciplined line of vehicles, engines idling like a low growl, ready to roll out. Michael climbed into the driver's seat of the Humvee, his hands gripping the wheel. He thought of his father, of the photograph they'd taken together, of the pride in Henry's eyes that day. That pride had never faded, not even under the weight of homelessness and scorn. Today, Michael would make sure the world saw it. Back at the dealership, the salesmen were oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon. Kyle was pitching a sedan to a hesitant couple, his charm dialed up to mask the unease that had crept into his gut. Greg sat in the office, refreshing the video's stats, chuckling at the latest batch of comments. Derek paced the lot, his earlier smirk replaced by a vague restlessness. The customers milled about, their conversations light, unaware of the seismic shift about to hit. The balloons above the lot swayed in the breeze, their bright colors a false promise of cheer in a place that had traded respect for profit. In the distance, a low rumble broke the afternoon's calm, like thunder rolling in on a clear day. Kyle paused mid-sentence, his head tilting toward the sound. Greg looked up from his phone, frowning. Derek stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. The rumble grew louder, closer, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the pavement. Customers turned, phones raised, their curiosity piqued. The woman who'd washed her car that morning, now driving past, slowed her vehicle, her breath catching as she saw the first glimpse of what was coming. Henry, still in the park, heard it too. He opened his eyes, his head tilting slightly, the sound stirring something deep in his chest. It was familiar, like the growl of vehicles he'd once ridden into battle, a sound that meant allies were near. He stood slowly, his boots scuffing the dirt, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't know what was coming, but he felt it. A shift, a reckoning, a moment when the world might finally see him for who he was. And as the first Humvee crested the hill, its American flag snapping in the wind, Henry Brooks straightened his shoulders, ready to meet whatever lay ahead. The rumble of the military convoy grew into a roar as it turned onto the dealership's street, a disciplined procession that seemed to pull the air taut. The lead Humvee, its American flag snapping sharply in the wind, rolled to a stop in the gravel lot, followed by armored transports and utility vehicles, their engines idling with a low, steady growl. Customers froze, their phones raised to capture the surreal scene, while the salesmen, Kyle, Greg, and Derek, stood rooted in place, their earlier smirks dissolving into confusion. The dealership's colorful balloons swayed above, absurdly cheerful against the convoy's stark power. The manager, a balding man in an ill-fitting suit, stumbled out of the office, his hands twitching as he muttered, "What's going on? Is this an emergency?" Lieutenant Michael Brooks stepped down from the Humvee, his uniform crisp, his movements precise. His face was a study in controlled fury, his eyes locking onto Kyle, the salesman who'd led the mockery of his father. The lot fell silent, the only sound the rhythmic pulse of the engines, a mechanical heartbeat underscoring the moment. Michael didn't address the manager's stammering. Instead, he walked straight to Kyle, his boots crunching on the gravel, his voice cutting through the stillness. "The man you humiliated this morning," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "is my father, Henry Brooks." Kyle's face drained of color, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Greg and Derek shifted uneasily, their eyes darting for an escape that wasn't there. Michael held up a photograph, its edges worn but the image clear. Henry in his dress uniform, receiving a commendation for saving a platoon in 2003. His face younger, but his posture unmistakable. "He dragged 3 wounded men to safety under heavy fire," Michael said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "His blood mixed with theirs in the Afghan dust. What have you done besides mock a hero for the clothes he wears?" The crowd murmured, some lowering their phones, shame flickering across their faces. A woman in the back, clutching her keys, wiped her eyes, her earlier indifference replaced by a quiet ache. Behind Michael, soldiers stepped from their vehicles, forming a line at parade rest, their faces impassive but their presence a wall of solidarity. One, a young sergeant with a scar across her cheek, approached Henry, who'd been brought to the lot by a soldier dispatched to the park. She carried a new cap, embroidered with the words, "Hero, Never Forgotten." With a formal salute, she presented it to him, her eyes meeting his, not as a superior, but as an equal. acknowledging the worth of a man who'd carried more than most. Henry took the cap, his weathered hands steady, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with something that hadn't been there that morning. Kyle stammered, his voice high and thin. I, I didn't know, man. It was just a joke. Michael's gaze didn't waver. You didn't know because you didn't care, he said. You saw a man down on his luck and thought you could make him smaller. You were wrong. The manager, sweating now, pushed forward, his voice trembling. We're so sorry, sir. This was a misunderstanding. Please let us make it right. Michael didn't look at him. We don't need your apologies, he said. We need you to remember the sacrifices that let you stand here, selling cars with a smirk. Henry stepped forward, the cap in his hands, his tattered jacket a stark contrast to the soldiers' crisp uniforms. The crowd parted for him, their silence heavy with respect. He looked at Kyle, then at the truck he'd touched that morning, its faded paint still holding his dreams. I only asked the price, he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of decades. But respect, that's what I deserved. The words landed like a quiet thunder, each syllable stripping away the salesman's bravado. Kyle's shoulders slumped, his eyes dropping to the gravel. Greg and Derek stood frozen, their earlier laughter a distant memory. A soldier in the line, an older man with gray at his temples, broke ranks to approach Henry. He extended a hand, his voice low but clear. You saved my brother in '03, he said. I never got to thank you. Henry shook his hand, a small nod passing between them. A moment of connection that needed no words. The crowd watched, some openly weeping now, their phones forgotten. A passing photographer, drawn by the convoy, snapped a shot. Henry in his worn clothes, surrounded by soldiers rendering honors, the flag sharp against the sky. The image would spread later, a testament to a man the world had tried to erase. Michael turned to his father, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange. Henry's faint shake of his head was all Michael needed. They didn't want the truck, didn't need the manager's promises. What they'd come for was bigger, heavier, more enduring. Michael faced the crowd, his voice rising just enough to carry. Freedom isn't free, he said. It's paid for by men like my father, men you pass by without a second glance. Remember them, honor them, because they've earned it. The soldiers snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and unified, a final tribute to Henry Brooks. As the convoy prepared to leave, Henry paused by the Humvee, his gaze sweeping the lot one last time. The salesmen stood silent, their arrogance shattered. The crowd watched, some whispering apologies, others vowing to do better. Henry climbed into the passenger seat beside Michael, the cap resting in his lap. The engines roared to life, and the convoy rolled out, leaving the dealership in a stunned hush. Henry didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a shadow, but as a man whose valor had finally been acknowledged. The convoy's engines faded into the distance, leaving the used car dealership in a silence that felt heavier than the roar that had preceded it. The gravel lot, moments ago a stage for reckoning, now stood quiet, the colorful balloons swaying listlessly above rows of untouched cars. Kyle, Greg, and Derek remained rooted where the soldiers had left them, their faces pale, their earlier bravado reduced to a memory. The manager, still clutching his clipboard, muttered something about policy changes to no one in particular, his voice lost in the weight of what had just unfolded. Customers lingered, some whispering among themselves, others staring at the spot where Henry Brooks had stood. His quiet words, respect, that's what I deserved, echoing in their minds like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Henry sat in the Humvee beside his son, Michael, the new cap resting in his lap, its embroidered words, hero, never forgotten, a stark contrast to the tattered jacket he wore. The city blurred past the window, its noise and bustle distant, as if the world had paused to let this moment breathe. Michael drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, but his glance flicked to his father now and then, a mix of pride and pain in his eyes. Henry felt the weight of that gaze, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any words. He traced the cap's stitching with a weathered finger, a faint smile touching his lips. For years, he'd carried his sacrifices alone, invisible to a world that saw only his poverty. Today, that world had been forced to look. Back at the dealership, the aftermath unfolded in fragments. The owner, a heavyset man who'd arrived late to the scene, pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with panic. "Please," he called after the departing convoy, though they were long gone. "Any vehicle on the lot, no charge. We didn't mean—" His words faltered as he met the crowd's eyes, some filled with tears, others with quiet judgment. He turned to Kyle, his voice sharp. "What did you do?" Kyle shook his head, his usual swagger gone, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know," he said again, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to him. Greg and Derek slipped into the office, their phones abandoned, the viral video now a noose they couldn't untie. The photograph taken by the passing photographer was already spreading. Posted to a veterans forum with a brief explanation, it showed Henry in his worn clothes, the cap in his hands, surrounded by soldiers saluting under the American flag. The image struck a chord, shared and reshared across platforms, each caption adding context. "This is Henry Brooks, who saved lives in Afghanistan. Today his son and his brothers in arms reminded a dealership what respect means." Comments poured in. "Shame on those salesmen. Honor to this hero. This is why we fight." Transforming Henry's story from a moment of cruelty to a beacon of recognition. By evening, the video of his humiliation had been drowned out, replaced by the image of his vindication. At Fort Carson, the convoy returned to base, the soldiers dispersing with quiet nods, their mission complete. Michael parked the Humvee and turned to his father. "You didn't need that truck," he said, his voice low but firm. Henry nodded, his eyes on the cap. "Never was about the truck," he said. "It was about remembering who I was." Michael's jaw tightened, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I should have been there sooner," he said. Henry shook his head, his hand resting briefly on his son's shoulder. "You were there when it mattered," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years, of battles fought together and apart. That night, Henry stayed at the base, a guest in the officers' quarters, a small room with a clean bed and a window overlooking the parade ground. He sat on the edge of the cot, the cat beside him, the photograph of him and Michael propped against the wall. For the first time in years, the nightmares didn't come. He slept deeply, the weight of the day's honor a shield against the dark. Outside, the flag on the base fluttered in the night breeze, a quiet sentinel for a man who'd never stopped serving. In the city, the ripples continued. The woman who'd washed her car that morning saw the viral photo on her phone, her breath catching as she recognized Henry's face. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the image, the guilt from her silence now a resolve to act. She donated to a veterans shelter the next day, her small gesture a step toward amends. At the coffee shop, the two elderly men saw the news on a TV above the counter, their earlier dismissal replaced by a quiet nod. "Should have known," one said, his voice thick. "He had the look." The other raised his coffee in a silent toast, a gesture too late but heartfelt. The dealership faced its own reckoning. The owner posted a public apology online, promising sensitivity training and donations to veteran causes. But the damage was done. Customers dwindled, the lot emptier each day, the salesman's laughter a ghost that haunted the silence. Kyle quit a week later, unable to meet his own eyes in the mirror. Greg and Derek stayed, but their bravado was gone, their interactions subdued, as if Henry's dignity had left a mark they couldn't erase. Henry Brooks didn't return to the dealership. He didn't need to. The truck, the salesman, the laughter, they were part of a world that had tried to diminish him, but failed. With Michael's help, he moved into a small apartment near the base, a place to rebuild, to reclaim the life war had stolen. The cap sat on a shelf, a reminder not of the morning's cruelty, but of the afternoon's honor. And as his story spread, carried by those who'd seen the truth, Henry became more than a veteran. He became a symbol of the valor that endures, the dignity that prevails, and the respect that, once given, can change everything. The seasons turned at Fort Carson, summer's heat giving way to the crisp bite of autumn, and the base hummed with its usual rhythm. Drills, deployments, the steady pulse of military life. Henry Brooks, once a shadow on the city streets, now walked these grounds with a quiet purpose. His small apartment, a modest space just off the base, was a far cry from the park benches and bridges he'd known for years. A single shelf held his treasures, the embroidered cap reading Hero, never forgotten, the faded photograph of him and Michael in uniform, and his polished military boots, no longer his only anchor, but a symbol of a life reclaimed. The nightmares still came, but they were softer now, tempered by the knowledge that he was no longer invisible. The photograph from the dealership, Henry surrounded by saluting soldiers, the American flag sharp against the sky, had become a quiet legend. It hung in the base's mess hall, a framed reminder of a day when respect triumphed over indifference. Shared across the internet, it had sparked a movement. Donations poured into veterans' shelters, businesses pledged support for homeless heroes, and strangers left comments like, "Never again," in honor to Henry. The story of Henry Brooks had done what he never could alone. It forced the world to look, to see the men and women it had passed by, to reckon with the debt owed to those who'd paid for freedom with their blood. At the used car dealership, the lot was quieter now. The gaudy balloons replaced by a single sign: "We support our veterans." The owner's promises of training and donations had been kept, but the scars of that morning lingered. Kyle was gone, chasing a fresh start in another town, haunted by the memory of Henry's steady gaze. Greg and Derek stayed, their voices softer, their sales pitches humbler, as if the weight of their mistake had reshaped them. The manager, once quick to dismiss, now paused to speak with every customer, his eyes searching for something he'd missed before. The dealership's business had recovered, but it was different. Less about profit, more about penance. A small step toward the decency Henry had demanded. Michael Brooks visited his father often, their bonds strengthened by the day they'd stood together against the world's cruelty. Over coffee in Henry's apartment, they spoke of small things: base gossip, Michael's latest drills, the way the leaves turned gold outside the window. But sometimes the conversation drifted to the past, to Afghanistan, to the men Henry had saved and the son he'd raised. "You taught me what strength is," Michael said one evening, his voice low. Henry shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "You reminded me," he said. "That's enough." Their silences were comfortable, filled with the understanding that only comes from shared sacrifice. The city, too, felt the ripples of Henry's story. The woman who'd washed her car that morning became a volunteer at a veterans shelter, her guilt transformed into action. She greeted Henry once, her voice trembling as she thanked him, and he nodded, his eyes kind, as if forgiving her silence. The two elderly men from the coffee shop, now regulars at a local VFW post, raised glasses to Henry's name, their earlier dismissal replaced by a quiet vow to listen next time. Across the country, others took up the call. Families wrote to their representatives, students organized fundraisers, and veterans groups shared Henry's photo as a rallying cry. See them, honor them. Henry didn't seek the spotlight. He spent his days quietly, helping at the base's community center, sharing stories with younger soldiers who listened with wide eyes. His laughter, once rare, came easier now, sparked by a private's bad joke or a sunny afternoon. He didn't talk about the dealership, didn't dwell on the salesman's laughter or the truck he'd never own. That dream had been a spark, a fleeting hope that led to something greater, a restoration of his place in a world that had tried to forget him. The cap on his shelf was enough, a reminder that he was seen, not as a shadow, but as a hero. One crisp morning, Henry stood outside his apartment, the air sharp with autumn's promise. Michael joined him, a thermos of coffee in hand, and they watched the flag on the base rise against the dawn. "You ever think about that truck?" Michael asked, his tone light but curious. Henry chuckled, a sound that carried years of weight and release. "Not much," he said. "Got what I needed right here." He gestured to the flag, to Michael, to the life he'd rebuilt. Michael nodded, a smile breaking through his soldier's reserve. "Good," he said. "You deserve it." The world moved on, as it always does. But Henry Brooks' story lingered, a quiet challenge to those who heard it. It wasn't about the convoy or the salesman's shame. It was about a man who'd carried his dignity through darkness and emerged into light. Freedom, as Henry had said, wasn't free, but decency should be. And in his steadfast valor, he'd shown that respect, once given, could heal wounds deeper than any war. His legacy wasn't in the viral photo or the donations. It was in the hearts he'd awakened, the eyes he'd opened, the truth he'd reclaimed, that every hero, no matter how unseen, deserves to be honored.